Thanks for being with us. I'm Laxmi Gopal. It's day 22 of the US-Israel war with Iran, and over the next 10 minutes or so, we're bringing you our special programme. So let's start with some of the day's main developments. 2 Iranian missiles have fired thousands of miles towards the joint US-UK base in Diego Garcia. The UK has allowed what it calls US defensive operations to launch from the base. The US says it's destroyed Iran's ability to launch high numbers of missiles and drones after striking underground sites along the Strait of Hormuz, where Iranian anti-ship missiles are stored. Fire rages at a US diplomatic facility in the Iraqi capital Baghdad amid reports of at least 3 attacks on the site, which usually houses American personnel. Iranian missiles are intercepted in the skies above Israel and the West Bank early on Saturday morning as attacks across the region continue. Well, let's bring you up to date with what we know after 2 ballistic missiles were fired at a critical joint US-UK military base in the Chagos Islands. It's led the UK to accuse Iran of recklessly lashing out. The distance from Iran to the island of Diego Garcia is close to 2,400 miles. And that's beyond the range limit that Iran's ballistic missiles were thought to have. Well, with me now is our world correspondent, Joe Inwood. Joe, what have the Ministry of Defence here in the UK and the Pentagon in the US had to say about this?
So in terms of official confirmation of these 2 ballistic missiles, we haven't got anything on the record, but it's been very widely reported, very widely understood. The BBC's spoken to many sources that confirm there were 2 missiles launched from Iran down towards Diego Garcia. Now, it's worth pointing out neither of them got through. We understand that one of them was shot down by the Americans and one failed to reach its target. It failed in some way in between. Now, the really important point you were talking about there is the range. It's about 2,400 miles, 3,700 kilometres from the nearest point of Iran to Diego Garcia. And that is way, way, way further than the furthest, the longest range missiles the Iranians were thought to have. Now, the caveat we should put in here is we don't know if the missiles could have covered that distance. But the fact the Iranians were willing to fire what are very expensive and quite limited supplies of these long-range missiles to try and reach that target suggests they certainly thought it was a possibility. And if that means that the Iranians have got missiles that can go 3,700 kilometres, 2,500 miles, well, that brings a vast, vast section of the world potentially into their kind of threat range.
This has been referred to as an asymmetric war. How much has Iran potentially been underestimated?
Yeah, I think it has been underestimated, firstly, in terms of its capacity to fire, the missiles it has. I mean, obviously, it's no way it's going to be a match in a straight fight between the Americans in Israel on one side and the Iranians on the other. That was never going to be matched. But the Iranians have been, I think, they've got a greater supply, they've used their missiles. It's not just about their range, actually it's about the way in which they've used them. And I think what was underestimated was the Iranian capacity, to the phrase Yvette Cooper used there, was lash out. And I think it's probably wouldn't be fair to describe hitting a military base as lashing out, but when they have lashed out is at their Gulf neighbours. And I think that was underestimated. But I think the other thing that was underestimated is their capacity and willingness to close the Straits of Hormuz. So in the way they're on, I think the Americans maybe did not think that they were going to act in the way that they have and do the economic damage that they have.
Joe, for now, thank you. Well, on that subject, the US says it's destroyed critical infrastructure, degrading Iran's capacity to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. In an update, the US Central Command said American forces had struck 8,000 targets in the last 3 weeks and had carried out 8,000 combat flights. Meanwhile, the US has temporarily lifted sanctions on some Iranian oil, allowing supplies currently at sea to be sold. It's a huge reversal of US policy and comes at a time of rising global energy prices, of course. Well, let's cross to Washington and speak to our North America correspondent, Simi Jolasho. A contradiction, Simi, between President Trump saying that the US was considering winding down war and also reports that the US is considering sending in ground troops.
Yeah, so President Trump says that he is considering winding down military operations against Iran. He also said that the US is close to meeting their objectives, which seem to have expanded since the start of this war to include essentially decimating Iran's military. It does feel like he was sort of defining the parameters of a victory here. He said that he's open to dialogue, but not to a ceasefire. And as you've mentioned, Luxby, that is slightly contradictory to reports that we're hearing here in the US by US media, including our news partner CBS, that the Department of Defense have made detailed preparations for deploying ground troops. And not only that, that there are nearly 5,000 Marines and several warships on the way to the Middle East, American Marines and warships from Japan and from America on the way to the Middle East. Now, it's not clear under what circumstances that these ground troops would be deployed, whether that's to increase military action on Hog Island, which is a key hub for the Iranians, or whether that would be to seize Iran's enriched uranium. President Trump was asked whether he would deploy ground troops on Thursday, and he said no, but he also said if he were to, he wouldn't disclose that to the journalist. The Pentagon has declined to comment, citing operational security. But what is clear here is that the Trump administration is expanding their military options, but not necessarily their military operations, if we're to go by what President Trump has said recently.
And Simi, how much is the Strait of Hormuz, with its power over energy prices, shaping the Trump administration's approach to the war and affecting their support domestically?
Well, there's that latest concession by the Trump administration to allow the sale of Iranian oil that's already at sea. And that has been taken by many as less of a strategy and perhaps a sign that the administration is feeling the pressure amidst Iran's tight grip on the Strait of Hormuz and soaring oil prices. Now, President Trump has expressed his frustration with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, attacking NATO allies, calling them cowards. But that concession has received criticism here from analysts who say, look, Iran could just use the money from that sale to fund their war effort. Democrats are also saying that this shows that President Trump is perhaps putting money into the pockets of the Iranian regime while taking money away from the American public through the soaring gas prices. And then there's also the issue of the cost of the war. We've heard that the Pentagon will be requesting an extra $200 billion in extra funding, which President Trump says is not only to do with Iran, but also to replenish military equipment and ammunition. But Democrats are saying, again, the size of this request, all the money that's being spent on the war, for a war that they say is a war of choice. Republicans are still largely supporting President Trump, and they are likely to have enough votes to approve that extra funding. But what is clear here is if this war drags on, and if the economic disruption from this war drags on, well, Republicans and the Trump administration may have a political price to pay.
Simi Jolo-Osho, thank you. Well, the US partner in this war is, of course, Israel, where there have been more Iranian strikes in the past 24 hours, with reports of cluster munitions hitting a kindergarten in the central city of Rishon LeZion. The school was closed at the time of the incident and no casualties were reported. Our correspondent James Waterhouse is following developments from Jerusalem.
We've seen falling shrapnel in Tel Aviv, to the north of here, but also close to the old city here in Jerusalem, close to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where a large crater appeared last night. Somehow no one was injured. But I think what is interesting is that this week, Benjamin Netanyahu, he sort of, in Hebrew, he said the war will last as long as it takes. In English, he said it may be over sooner than people think. He was slapped down before when he struck an Iranian gas field. He is following Donald Trump's lead to an extent, but when you see Donald Trump committing more to this war, where you've got these reports of troops being sent to the Strait of Hormuz, reports of elite units trying to seize hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium from Iran, when you have these kind of reports, as far as Israel is concerned, that is an extension of its window to further not just degrade the Iranian leadership, but also its proxy forces in Lebanon to the north as well, where we've seen continued strikes. But what you're not hearing being talked about is regime change in Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu is almost mirroring Donald Trump's message that it's for the Iranian people to rise up, and there is little sign of that happening.
James Waterhouse. Well, for the millions inside Iran, the war has overshadowed the Nowruz celebrations marking Persian New Year. As people across the country pause to reflect on the past year and look ahead into the new, some have sent messages to the BBC's Persian service. The following are voice notes from people living inside Iran, spoken by colleagues from BBC Persian.
Happy New Year to you. I'm very happy. Things are going well. That's because it's a few days since Tehran has been hit heavily.
I get upset when the strikes are where my friends are. They hear the sounds of them and the like. Then, when Instagram got connected, I saw how many civilians had died.
It's the first year that the evil king is no more. What could be better than this? And the regime is close to falling. So I'm full of hope and energy.
The view there from people inside Iran. The US-based human rights activists news agency says it's now counted 1,398 civilian deaths in Iran, including 210 children since the war began 3 weeks ago. BBC Persian's Bahman Kalbasi is in New York and told us what he's been able to gauge of the mood inside the country.
This is now the first day of the new year, Nowruz, and it's the strangest one in many years that we are experiencing war and a digital blackout at the same time. So, as you said, getting information is not easy, and the mood is not of celebration in much of the country, given what is going on. But there are many Iranians who also try, even under bombardment, to carry on a daily life and celebrate the arrival of spring. So the mixed feelings is very much present. We have people who have left major cities, especially to the Caspian shore, which is a little safer, even though there has been Israeli attacks in the northern part of Iran as well. But nevertheless, the anticipation and anxiety continues, not just for this war to end, but also what comes after, because if the regime stays in power, which all signs at this point point to the fact that this might happen, how much of more brutality will the public endure from a government that is now wounded?
Well, the war has now entered its fourth week, and as the impact around the world continues, President Trump says he's considering winding down US operations. But is there any sign of that actually happening? Let's get a final thought from our world news correspondent, Joe Inwood. So much still unknown, Joe.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Donald Trump is, should we say, often a little ambiguous, maybe even contradictory in his messaging, doesn't really help that fact. So just over the last couple of days, we've had him say he's not interested in a ceasefire, and then he says he might be winding down the operation. But I think the really important thing to remember here is that starting wars is a lot easier than finishing them. And when they launched this 3 weeks ago, it's into its fourth week now, they maybe couldn't have foreseen the extent to which the Iranians would fight back, the damage they'd be able to cause. And remember, both sides get a vote in this. The Americans can say, we'd like to bring this war to an end. But unless the Iranians agree as well, it just won't happen. And just in the last few minutes, I've actually got a line of copy here, breaking news from the Israeli military. They've confirmed, they say, that for the first time Iran launched a missile that was 4,000 kilometers. We don't have it confirmed which missile, but one could suspect that might have been one of the ones launched at Diego Garcia, which is, as said, really quite significant. And what that just goes to show is the potential for the Iranians to continue to cause disruption, to cause damage, not just in the region, but far further afield. And I think that's the challenge the Americans are going to have, and the Israelis as well. If they decide they want to end this war, what if the Iranians decide they don't? Because this could be a Pandora's box, and it's really not clear how we're going to get all sides to agree that the fighting should stop.
Yep, still definitely no clarity on that. Joe, thank you. Well, whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thanks for your time, and we'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.